Dude, that's so nasty. Peterson, Waldo to his friends, let the ant crawl across his tongue for a few seconds as the rest of us watched. When he swallowed it down, he ran his tongue out again to show us that it was gone, grinning as we made noises of repulsion. I've been a resident of Stragview Prison for the last 3 years, and I'll continue to be a resident for another year and a half at the least. A couple caught me in their house one night, and after shoving past the guy to get out, I guess he hit his head on the way down. I got 8 years for assault and burglary, and on my first day, I met Waldo. They call him Waldo because of the thick glasses and the striped hat he always wears. I couldn't tell you where he got it. I've never seen anything like it at the commissary, at least. Most people believe he made it himself, and I'm prone to agree. He used to work in laundry, emphasis on used to, and I've certainly seen weirder clothing items come out of that place. No one took it from him, not even the admins, and the name Waldo seems to have stuck. Waldo was known for 2 things on the compound: his hat and eating unusual things. Waldo was in prison for assault, but his talent was his cast iron stomach. When he introduced himself to me, he was eating something out of a Tupperware and smiling hugely. I shook his hand and told him my name, only then to realize that the bowl was crawling with crickets. He was eating them by the handful, scarfing them down with loud crunches, and he laughed as he noticed me noticing the bugs. Grounds crew's been catching them for me for a week now. Gave me $20 of canteen to eat the whole bowl, and that's just more food for Waldo. Waldo was an exhibitionist, pure and simple. People paid him money to eat things, usually bugs or old food, and Waldo ate them down without complaint. Moldy bananas? No problem. Cockroaches? By the fistful. Waldo would eat anything, and it didn't always have to be edible things either. He would eat batteries, a pack of double A's at a time, and he would eat sand right off the rec yard. Nothing seemed to make him sick or slow him down. We all just watched in awe as he ate anything that would stand still long enough. That was until he found the ants. "What do you reckon they are?" I asked. The hill had cropped up seemingly overnight, a giant mound of red clay and fine sand, and it looked like nothing so much as a termite hill in a National Geographic magazine. Faust reached out with his stump, then growled as he traded it for the hand with some fingers on it. He was still getting used to only having one hand, even after several months. I grabbed his wrist before he could touch it, and he looked at me with a mixture of confusion and agitation. Can't have you losing the other one, Faust," I said, trying to postpone his rage. Faust was a cool dude, but he was quick to anger. "Yeah, well, they don't look like they eat much." In that, he was wrong. The ants were just as strange as the hill they inhabited. Each of the crawling things was the size of my thumb, veins of purple worming through their deep red exoskeleton. They had pincers on their heads, long wiggling antennae, and 12 scuttling legs that took them quickly across the hill. They were carrying all sorts of things, food, other insects, and I found myself wondering if they could be a threat. How much would those pincers hurt if they got a hold of you? "What you looking at?" I jumped as Waldo came up behind us, Faust and I looking around like we'd been caught doing something wrong. His eyes got big as he saw what lay behind us, and he made an impressed sound as he looked at the hill with the roaming insects. He had clearly never seen anything like them before, and they thrilled him as only something unknown can. As Faust watched him, I could see an idea beginning to form, and I was not fond of the look. "How much?" Faust asked suddenly. "How much for what?" Waldo asked, looking back at him confused. "How much to eat one?" Waldo looked back at the ants, thinking it over, before settling on a price. $20 a canteen, and I'll eat it right now." Faust groaned. "Man, 20 bones? That's pricey." Waldo had caught one of the ants between his fat fingers, and he was lifting it up for a better look. The ant wriggled furiously, trying to escape as it clacked those monstrous jaws. Waldo was being careful not to put his finger too close to the pincers, but the way the ant was thrashing, it would get him eventually. "Going once," Waldo said. "What about 10? I can do 10, Faust hedged. "Nope, gotta be 20, Waldo said, moving his hand back towards the hill. "Going twice." I'll put up 10, I said, not really sure why I had said it. That seemed to be what he was waiting to hear, and he threw the ant into his mouth and bit down with a loud crunch. Sold. He chewed the ant, his face becoming almost rapturous the longer he chewed it. He looked like someone eating a sweet for the first time, someone taking a bite of a favorite meal. and he turned back to look at the hill with real desire. I could swear there was drool sliding out of the corners of his mouth as he watched them scuttle around, his hands shaking a little as he reached towards the hill. "Whoa, man," Faust said. "You win, You ate one. Don't get crazy." Waldo either didn't hear him or didn't care. He was suddenly picking up ants like they were berries on a bush. He was popping them into his mouth, one after another, snapping them off the hill as quick as he could with his deft hands. A thick orange juice was running down his chin, the crunching sounding like poppers, the ones we sometimes threw as kids on 4th of July. And when I stepped up beside him, he turned and glowered at me like a dog with a bone. "Waldo, you got him, man. No need to," but he smacked my hand away when I tried to touch his shoulder. He bent over the anthill and started gobbling them down. He pushed them into his mouth by the handful, his throat bulging as they slid greedily into him. Soon he was pulling handfuls of dirt off the mound, the dirt streaking down his face like a kid eating chocolate pudding. When he pushed the mound over, the mud and dirt structure fell easily. I saw the ants come swarming out. They moved over his arms, mixing easily with the coarse hair that lay there. If they bit him, I never saw him wince, and I could only imagine that his throat was being nipped as he swallowed them. "What in the hell is going on over here?" came a voice from behind us. Faust and I turned to see Officer Grange and his big hairy fingers in the loops of his duty belt, the leather creaking as his gut pushed against it. Grange was a big guy, almost 6.5 feet, and his belly grew a little bigger every year he remained in DOC. He was what the inmates called a beater, a guard who would lay hands on you even if you didn't have to, but his face was more curious than angry today. He wasn't sure what he was looking at, and the sight made him more concerned than angry. Waldo hadn't even noticed him. His eyes goggled, the orbs swimming with tears as he found what he was looking for. The queen ant was the size of a small mouse. Her body was a deep green, her eyes a swirl of fluorescent neon as she inclined her head up to look at Waldo. Grange told us to stop him, but before we could even reach for him, Waldo had taken the fat little matriarch between his thumb and forefinger. His hands shook as he lifted her to eye level, the two sharing a long stare before he popped her into his mouth. He fought us as we pulled him off the hill, but his face was awash with ecstatic joy. I'd seen one of my nephews eat fudge cooked by my mom once, and his face had looked just that way. The perfect mixture of joyous completion and the despair of knowing that you will never find anything like it ever again. Grange yelled for us to get him back to the dorm, and it wasn't till we got out of the rec yard that Waldo stopped shaking. He still looked off, twin brown streaks marking the corners of his mouth, discarded legs clinging to his lips, and when we got him back to the dorm and set him on his bunk, he just stared ahead like he didn't know he was still on the world. Faust returned with a small pile of noodles and snack cakes, and he dumped them onto Waldo's bed. That's when I remembered that I still owed him my half of the deal. I came back with a bunch of commissary and added them to the collection of foodstuffs. Normally, Waldo would have scooped it all up and pushed it into a locker before the leeches in the dorm could come around to beg for food, but he just let it sit there as he stared at the wall. He was acting weird, not at all like his usual self, and the longer Faust and I sat there, the more it started to worry us. Finally, after a few hours of trying to engage him in activities or conversation, we both just left to go about our business. When I went to get a shower later, I saw that he hadn't moved an inch the whole afternoon. He was still just sitting there, staring at the wall, the dried dirt starting to look like blood in the hazy fluorescence as it coursed down his face. I came out of the shower when the guard started yelling about count time, and I saw that Waldo was laying on his side. He was coughing, silent hacks that racked his body. He had the covers pulled up, shivering hard enough to make the bed frame rattle, and I watched him out of the corner of my eye as I got dressed. When he didn't sit up for count, I knew that something was wrong. Officer Darrow blew his whistle then, and I saw him coming out of the station with the roster in his gloved hand. "All right, get your IDs out and sit up for count." He had taken only a few steps when his keen eyes fixated on the prone form of Waldo. He didn't go right for him. That would have seemed too personal and would have made him look like he was looking for trouble. Instead, he made his way along, checking IDs and checking off names until he finally came to the bunk he wanted. He stood at the foot of the bed and tapped his foot against the leg of the bed. "Wargree, inmate Wargree, sit up for count and present your ID." He appeared calm, but Waldo wouldn't be the first inmate that Darrow had put his hands on, or that he'd pushed out of bed. Darrow was always spoiling for a fight. It was why they wouldn't let him work confinement anymore, and he had been forced to find his sport elsewhere. He'd been put in E-dorm because they felt that he couldn't stir up too much trouble in here, but whoever had decided that was a fool. Darrow stirred up trouble wherever he was. It was in his nature. Waldo continued to shiver beneath his blankets, ignoring Darrow for all intents and purposes. Darrow smiled, but it was like a wolf smiling at a lamb. "Last chance, Wargry. Sit up and present your ID, or shit's about to get real bad for you." Waldo coughed, and it sounded like a handful of gravel hitting the ground. I tried to look, but I couldn't see what exactly he had coughed up. Whatever it was, it had escaped Darrow's notice. He was looking forward to a fight, and he didn't care who it was with. He pulled back the covers, and I could see that Waldo was still wearing the same dusty prison clothes he'd had on in the yard. He'd just laid over, it seemed, and he didn't even realize that Darrow was talking to him. When Darrow reached down and took him by the shoulders, he lifted him up into a sitting position. Waldo looked dazed as he blinked his eyes at the guard. "You deaf, Wargry? It's count time, and I know that you..." His voice was harsh, but it turned into a disgusted yelp as Waldo vomited up a cluster of squirming ants on him. They were the same ones he'd been eating, and as they came up from his guts, they sank their pincers into Darrow's arm. Darrow shouted as he swiped at him, trying to clear them off him, but his efforts were useless. For every one he knocked off, about 5 more clamped down and dangled from his skin like tumors. Darrow reeled back from Waldo, screaming as the ants bit him. His radio crackled as someone from the booth noticed him. I heard emergency traffic being called and rushed over to Waldo to see if I could help him. Waldo was leaning against his bunk across from him. The ants were coming out of him in a red cluster now. They looked like blood as they hit the floor, thick clots of pulsating red that slid up his leg and back towards his mouth, even as he vomited them onto the floor. I took him by the shoulders and turned him to look at me, and it took everything I had not to drop him again. His front was covered in ants, a squirming line of them already crawling up and back into his mouth. His face had this dumb look of surprise on it, but when his eyes met mine, I stumbled away and fell back over the bunk. My ass hit the floor then, and I scrambled away as I tried to get away from this ant terror. His eyes had become the same multi-spectrum segments the Queen's had been, and I pushed myself under the nearest bunk as I tried to escape him. When the other guards came through the door, they forced him to the ground in a storm of bodies, and it was almost a mercy not to have to look at him anymore. At least, until they all started screaming. Waldo emerged from the stack on all fours, as 4 guards slapped at themselves and rolled away from him. Waldo was more ant than human now, and those odd eyes were the only thing visible amidst the squirming mass of bugs that covered him. He was little more than a writhing mass of red flesh, small oceans with their own tidal poles as they boiled over his body. I watched as his hat emerged from the top, and it was the only real way to still identify him. One of the guards tried to gas Waldo, his can jittering as the ants snapped at him, and they parted as the chemical arced across him. I could see a swath of red flesh beneath before they closed ranks again. Waldo was gone, it seemed, and whether he was controlling the ants or they were controlling him, it didn't really matter anymore. They were one creature, and their symbiosis seemed permanent. At least, until Captain Hulk and his security detail came through the door. That was when Sergeant Moore hit Waldo with his taser. The 3-person group stood stunned by what they were seeing, and Moore's shot was likely just panic fire. The prongs hit Waldo square in the chest, the electricity sizzling up the lines as it made the ant flesh crackle and dance. Something screamed from deep within the ant mound, and I realized that Waldo was still under there somewhere. As Moore kept squeezing the trigger, Sergeant Dace drew his own taser and shot the mound of ants as well. The combined streams made the creature buck and waver, and when the ants fell off of him, it was like hail hitting the ground. Waldo fell amongst them, crushing most of them, and lay twitching as the captain and his sergeants moved in to assess the damage. It was a real shit show, but they managed to get it all covered up. The guards who had been hurt ended up going to the hospital. Many of them had been bit over 50% of their bodies, and I heard a couple of them almost died. I never saw Waldo again after that night. They took him out in cuffs, but it looked like they were heading to the rec field rather than medical. I remember seeing Waldo look back at me, his weird segmented eyes staring sadly back at the faces clustered against the windows, and I wondered if it might not have been kinder to just let him die. I never saw another one of those weird anthills either, but the rec yard was closed for 2 weeks after that while they tore up the grass and dumped pesticide by the truckload. Stragview, I've come to learn over the years, has a lot of strange stories like this one. From the rats to the ghosts to the strange creatures that inhabit the shadows of this place, Stragview is a place outside of time and space. I only have a year left in this place, and I pray I'll be allowed to leave. I wonder if anyone is truly allowed to leave Stragview once it's got its claws into them. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. That's right, folks, another grand installment of our Stragview series. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll enjoy learning more about that mysterious prison in the Georgia mountains. If you enjoyed tonight's story, and you're not already subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that bell so you don't miss out on any of the cool stuff we do over here. As many of you are aware, I do weekly polls to see what you'd like me to read, so go ahead and cast your vote and hear the stuff that you want to hear on this channel. Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our patrons before we go. Thanks to the Irish Devil for being our Spooky Ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks to Xaronana, Emily Coltsfoot, and Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And thanks to Glen Jenkins for being our Ghostwriter tier contributor. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. There's a link below, and you can check out all the cool stuff we do there. If you contribute at the $5 level, that's the Spooky Skeleton tier, you also get your Spooky a day early on a Tuesday and a Thursday. If you'd like to check out my new book, Sleepless Nights, there's a link below as well. If you'd like a signed copy, get in touch with me. I'd be happy to mail you one. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.